My name is Danielle Carter. I'm 34 years old, and until that night I thought I had finally carved out a life that was safe, stable, and mine alone. I was wrong. 6 years of silence had passed since I'd last seen my parents and younger sister, and I had convinced myself they had moved on with their perfect little world in Ohio. But on that gray Saturday afternoon in Portland, I opened my front door to find them standing on my porch with rolling suitcases, looking like weary travelers, checking into a hotel they believed belonged to them. Before I dive in, let me pause. If you're watching this, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss how I fought back against the ultimate betrayal from the very people who should have loved me most. Back to that moment, my pulse stuttered as the cold Oregon rain misted over their coats. My father, Harold, still carried himself with the stiff-backed authority of a man who thought he owned every room he walked into. My mother, Linda, had her lips pressed in that thin line of disapproval I knew too well, though her eyes glistened with something I couldn't place: shame, or maybe just exhaustion. And then there was Melissa, my sister, clutching her designer tote like she'd just come from a courthouse, not a 3-day road trip across the country. I didn't even get a chance to speak before my father's voice cut through the damp air.
"Danielle,"
he said, steady and cold.
"you don't even have a real family. This house, it should be ours. We're moving in."
The words lodged in my chest like a shard of glass. For a second I thought I'd misheard. My cottage wasn't much, but every board, every painted wall, every flower bed out front was mine, hard-won after years of scraping and clawing my way back from nothing. And here they were, claiming it as if my survival meant nothing at all. Melissa breezed past me first, rolling her suitcase across my hardwood floor without asking. "The kitchen's cute," she chirped, snapping a quick photo on her phone. "This'll work." I froze on the threshold, raindrops slipping down my hair. My hands trembled, but not from the cold. It was fury, disbelief, and a familiar ache, the same old message from childhood echoing back. "You don't matter. What's yours isn't really yours." "Excuse me," I managed, my voice thin but sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" My mother brushed past me too, setting her umbrella by the door like she belonged. "Sweetheart, you've got more space than you could ever need. It's only fair we use it. Families share." Her words burned. Families share? Where had that generosity been when I'd begged for a couch to crash on during the worst nights of my life? Where had it been when I'd been sleeping in my car with $25 in my bank account? I looked at my father, hoping for even a flicker of hesitation. Instead, he stared me down, jaw clenched.
"This is settled, Danielle. We're staying. You'll adjust."
Something in me snapped then, not with screaming or pleading, but with a calm so steady it surprised me. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I slipped my phone from my pocket and dialed 3 numbers I had prayed I'd never need in this house. 911. Melissa's eyes widened. "You wouldn't—" "Try me," I said, my voice trembling but firm. The operator's voice on the line was cool, detached, and oddly comforting as I explained that people had entered my home without permission. As I gave my address, my family's chatter blurred into background noise. For once, their opinions didn't matter. When I hung up, silence filled the room. My father's stare hardened, but for the first time there was something else there: uncertainty. I held his gaze, heart pounding. I didn't know how the police would react, or how ugly this was about to get. But one thing was clear. I wasn't the scared daughter anymore. This was my house, my life, and I wasn't going to let them take either. When I closed my eyes that night after calling 911, waiting for the police to arrive, my mind pulled me backward, back to Ohio, where all of this had started. If you really want to understand why those words from my father cut so deep, you have to know the world I grew up in. I was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every lawn seemed trimmed to the same length and every family looked picture perfect. From the outside, the Carters seemed no different. Dad, the hardworking store manager, Mom, the friendly librarian, 2 daughters who looked close in age. We had a small, 2-story house with vinyl siding and a swing set out back. It looked like the kind of place where love lived. But step through the front door, and you'd see how uneven the scales of affection really were. My younger sister Melissa was the sun in my parents' solar system. When she brought home a spelling test with a B, Mom baked a pie to celebrate. When I brought home straight A's on a full report card, the most I got was, "Good. That's what we expect from you, Danielle." I remember one winter evening, sitting at the kitchen table with my homework spread out, the smell of chili simmering on the stove. I was proud. I'd just won first place in the county's science fair with a project I'd worked on for weeks. My fingers were still stained with glue and marker ink. I slid the ribbon across the table toward my dad. "Look, Dad, first place." He barely glanced up from the stack of bills he was sorting. "That's nice. Did you shovel the driveway yet?" Snow's piling up. Melissa bounced in a moment later, cheeks rosy from choir practice. "Guess what, Daddy? I got picked for the Christmas solo." He dropped the bills instantly, face lighting up. "That's my girl." He swung her into a hug, his voice booming with pride. I sat there quietly, the ribbon limp in my hands, learning once again that in my family, achievements only mattered if they belonged to Melissa. Mom wasn't much different. She had this way of smoothing Melissa's hair, calling her my little star, while handing me chores as if that was my natural role. Once, when I came home flushed with excitement because my English teacher said I had real talent for writing, Mom brushed it aside. "Melissa has debate practice tomorrow. Can you iron her blouse for her?" I ironed it. Of course I did. Because in that house, refusing would only earn me silence or, worse, one of Dad's lectures about gratitude. Looking back, what stung the most wasn't just the favoritism. It was the casualness of it, as though it was the most natural order of things. Melissa didn't even notice half the time. Or maybe she did, and liked it. She'd flash me a smug little smile whenever Dad bragged about her to neighbors, completely ignoring me standing right there. The imbalance grew sharper as we got older. When Melissa turned 16, Dad handed her the keys to a used Honda Civic he'd been fixing up for months. "You deserve this," he told her. When I turned 16, I got a reminder that the diner down the street was hiring waitresses. "If you want gas money," Mom said, "you'll need to earn it yourself." So I worked. I served pancakes and burgers after school, scrubbed counters until my hands smelled of bleach, and tucked tips into a jar under my bed. Melissa drove her Civic to football games while I walked home in the snow, my work uniform damp with grease. It wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, about belonging. Every family photo seemed to lean toward Melissa, her smile brighter, her spot in the center guaranteed. I often felt like the extra puzzle piece no one knew what to do with. But even then, even as a teenager aching from being overlooked, I told myself it would make me tougher. If no one was going to cheer for me, I'd learn to cheer for myself. If no one built me a safety net, I'd build one from scratch. That belief, the seed of self-reliance, wasn't something I invented alone. It came from someone outside those walls, someone who refused to let me forget my worth. And that someone was my grandfather, George Thompson. If Melissa was the sun in my parents' universe, then my grandfather, George Thompson, was the steady ground beneath my feet. He lived an hour away in Dayton, Ohio, in a weathered but proud little house he'd built himself after my grandmother passed. Summers with him were my salvation, a reprieve from the constant reminder that I was second best under my own roof. The moment I stepped off the bus each June, I felt the tension slip from my shoulders. His place smelled of cedar and sawdust, a mix of the workshop out back and the tomato vines crawling across his garden fence. He'd be waiting on the porch, suspenders stretched over a faded flannel shirt, grinning as if I were the only person in the world who mattered. "There's my girl," he'd say, pulling me into a hug that smelled of peppermint and wood shavings. Life with Grandpa George was simple but full. He taught me to hammer nails straight, to measure twice before cutting once, to kneel in the dirt without fear of ruining my clothes. While Melissa was at debate camp or cheerleading retreats, I was learning how to sand down an oak table or plant rows of beans. One afternoon, when I was about 12, I tried to help him repair the back fence. My hands shook as I held the board in place, terrified I'd ruin it. He noticed right away.
Why you trembling, kiddo?
Because if I mess this up, you'll be mad, I admitted. He chuckled, set the hammer aside, and crouched down so we were eye level. His blue eyes were sharp, not with criticism, but with conviction.
Danielle, listen to me.
Mistakes don't ruin you. Giving up ruins you. And don't you ever let anyone decide what you're worth. Not your teachers, not your parents, not even me. That's your call. His words hit me like warm sunlight after weeks of rain. No one else in my family had ever said anything like that to me. From then on, I carried those sentences like armor. He also pushed me toward independence in ways that seemed small then, but shaped everything later. When I was 14, he handed me the keys to his old pickup.
Go ahead.
Just down the driveway and back. I laughed nervously. Grandpa, I can't drive yet. Then today's a good day to start learning. One day you'll need to get yourself places without waiting for permission. That first clumsy ride down his gravel drive, with my foot jerking the pedals, became a metaphor for how he saw me. Capable, even when I didn't believe it. Evenings at his house were my favorite. We'd sit on the porch swing, sipping sweet tea while the crickets chirped. He'd tell me stories about working double shifts at the mill to support his kids after my grandmother died. His hands were calloused, his back bent, but his voice carried pride.
I didn't have much, Danielle, but I kept a roof over their heads. That's what matters. Don't depend on anyone else to do that for you. Build your own shelter, brick by brick.
At the time, I thought he meant literally. Later, when I found myself staring at eviction notices and sleeping in my car, I realized he'd meant something deeper. Emotional shelter, too. Melissa rarely visited him, claiming his place was too boring. My parents came only on holidays, bringing store-bought pies instead of helping him fix his roof or weed the garden, but I went every chance I could. Not just because I loved him, but because with him I wasn't invisible. He celebrated my wins, no matter how small. When I won a local art contest, he framed the certificate and hung it in his hallway. When I saved enough tips to buy my own second-hand laptop, he clapped so loudly the neighbors peeked over the fence.
That's my granddaughter, he said proudly, making her own way.
Looking back, I see how he planted the seeds of courage I'd cling to later, when the world seemed determined to knock me down. My parents' house might have been where I slept most nights, but Grandpa George's home was where I belonged. And it was his belief in me, unyielding, unshakable, that would become the anchor I reached for when everything else collapsed. Grandpa George's voice stayed in my head like an echo. Don't let anyone decide your worth. I held on to those words through middle school and into high school, clinging to them like a secret shield. But shields only go so far when the people tearing you down are the ones who are supposed to lift you up. By my junior year at Westfield High School in Columbus, I had found the one thing that lit me up from the inside: design. It started in art class, with charcoal sketches and collages that gave me space to breathe. Then Mrs. Wilkins, my art teacher, introduced me to the computer lab's design software. She showed me how shapes, colors, and fonts could tell a story without a single word. I stayed after school almost every day, tinkering until the janitor flicked the lights as a hint to leave. For the first time, I could imagine a future that wasn't gray and predictable. It was vibrant, creative, mine. Mrs. Wilkins saw it too. One afternoon, she pulled me aside as I packed up my sketchbook.
Danielle, you've got an eye for this. Don't waste it. Apply to colleges with strong design programs. You could really go places.
Her belief filled me with warmth. I let myself picture it. Maybe Chicago, maybe New York, maybe somewhere I hadn't dared to dream about. A campus filled with students who loved the same things I did. A world that valued my vision. But that picture shattered the moment I brought it up at dinner. Dad was at the head of the table, fork clinking against his plate. Melissa was home from cheerleading practice, scrolling through her phone while Mom reminded her about an upcoming debate tournament. I cleared my throat. "I've been talking with Mrs. Wilkins," I said carefully. "She thinks I should apply to schools with strong graphic design programs." For a beat, no one spoke. Then Dad snorted.
Design? You mean playing with colors on a computer? That's not a career, Danielle. That's a hobby. I gripped my fork tighter. It's more than that. There are real jobs. Advertising, branding, marketing. He cut me off. Real jobs are steady. They put food on the table. Nursing. Business. Something practical. Creative fields are for people who have a trust fund to fall back on. You don't. Mom chimed in, her tone falsely soothing. Your father's right. Nursing would be perfect for you. Hospitals always need staff. You'll never be out of work. Melissa didn't even look up from her phone. Yeah, Danny. I mean, come on. You? Competing with real artists? Be serious. Her words stung worse than Dad's dismissal. At least with him, I expected the blow. With her, it was like salt in an already open wound. I swallowed hard, fighting the lump in my throat. But I've won awards. Mrs. Wilkins thinks... Dad slammed his fork down. We're not wasting money on some art degree. End of discussion. The kitchen went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. My hands trembled as I shoved peas around my plate. In that moment, the dreams I'd sketched in my notebook felt like they were burning to ash. Later that night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my chest aching. Part of me wanted to give in, to choose the safe route, to stop fighting. But another part, a louder, braver part, remembered Grandpa George's words. Don't let anyone decide your worth. The next morning, I took action. At school, I filled out applications to Columbus Community College, which had an affordable design program, and a few state universities that offered scholarships. I didn't tell my parents until the letters of acceptance arrived. When I finally announced it at breakfast, Dad barely looked up from his paper. Your life, your mistake, he said flatly. Mom sighed and kept buttering Melissa's toast. Melissa smirked over her orange juice. Guess I'll be the one making real money then. I forced myself to meet her eyes. We'll see. Inside, fear twisted with determination. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. I'd have to work long hours, juggle classes and jobs, and face the disapproval of the people who should have been my biggest supporters. But I also knew this. I would not surrender the only dream that had ever made me feel alive. That morning, as I walked to the bus stop, the cold Ohio wind whipping my hair across my face, I whispered a promise to myself. I will build my own future, even if I have to build it alone. The day I received my acceptance letter from Columbus Community College, I held it like proof that my dreams weren't just a childish phase. It was real. A door cracked open in a house where all the other doors had been slammed shut, but excitement alone couldn't shield me from the reality. If I wanted this life, I'd have to build it without the blessing or the wallet of my parents. The next 2 years blurred into late-night shifts at the diner, textbooks propped open on the counter while I refilled coffee cups. I slept too little, worked too much, and somehow kept my GPA high enough to transfer to Kent State University for my bachelor's in design. Every milestone came with silence from my parents, or worse, backhanded remarks. By the time graduation rolled around, I no longer expected applause. Still, a small part of me hoped. I mailed the invitations, even though my gut told me they'd find an excuse. The morning of the ceremony, the gymnasium buzzed with families clutching bouquets and balloons. I scanned the rows of bleachers, heart hammering. No sign of my mom's careful curls, or Dad's stiff posture, or Melissa's bored expression. Just strangers and their cheering voices. Then I spotted him, Grandpa George, easing himself onto a metal chair with his cane, face breaking into a proud grin when he saw me in my cap and gown. My chest tightened with relief. At least one person in this world had shown up for me. When my name was called, his applause cut through the crowd. It wasn't loud, not compared to the booming cheers around me, but it was steady, unwavering. I clutched my diploma, blinking against the sting in my eyes. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was defiance, proof that I could succeed on my own terms. After the ceremony, we sat together on a bench outside the school. The spring air smelled faintly of lilacs, and students milled about taking pictures with their families. I tried not to stare too long at the hugs and group photos I wasn't part of. Grandpa handed me a small envelope. "A little something to help you start out," he said. Inside was a modest check,
but it felt heavier than gold. Use it for whatever gets you closer to your dream. I swallowed hard. I don't know how to thank you.
Don't thank me, he said, patting my hand. Just promise me you'll keep building. You've got the fire, Danielle. Don't let anyone snuff it out. That night, back at my apartment, I sat cross-legged on the floor, diploma in one hand, his envelope in the other. The silence of my phone, no call, no text, no congratulations from my parents, confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't going to get their approval. Maybe I never had. But I had something better. A vision of where I wanted to go. In the weeks that followed, I packed up the cramped apartment I shared with 2 roommates. Every box sealed with tape felt like a declaration. I was moving forward, not staying stuck in the life my parents mapped out. I researched cities where design was more than a hobby, where creative minds were building futures. Portland, Oregon kept appearing at the top of my searches. The city was growing, buzzing with small studios, coffee shops filled with freelancers, and art spilling into the streets. It sounded like oxygen. When I told my parents I was heading west, Dad's voice was sharp over the phone. "You'll regret this. You think you're special? You're not. Portland will chew you up." Mom sighed in the background, her words barely audible. "Be careful, Danielle." Melissa didn't bother calling at all. I hung up, heart pounding but strangely lighter. Their disapproval wasn't news, it was confirmation. And maybe, in some twisted way, it was the permission I needed to leave without looking back. The morning I drove out of Ohio, the sun rose behind me, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. My car was old, packed with secondhand furniture and design equipment I'd scrimped to buy. The road stretched ahead, long and uncertain. But for the first time in my life, uncertainty didn't terrify me. I rolled down the window, let the wind whip through my hair, and whispered into the open air, "This is my life, and I'm finally living it on my terms." Portland felt like possibility when I first arrived. The air was damp with pine and rain, coffee shops buzzed with young people hunched over laptops, and murals sprawled across brick walls like the city itself was cheering for me. I found work quickly, an entry-level designer at a small marketing agency. The pay wasn't much, but I didn't care. Every day I got to create. For 2 years, I woke up with purpose. Then, without warning, the bottom fell out. It was a Monday morning when I showed up to the office and found the door locked. A white sheet of paper flapped under duct tape. Closed due to bankruptcy. Effective immediately. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching my coffee, while the drizzle soaked through my coat. My coworkers gathered in a stunned huddle around me, no one daring to speak the obvious truth. We were unemployed. At first, I convinced myself it was temporary. I polished my resume, sent out applications, and took freelance gigs wherever I could. But the recession had hit Portland hard, and marketing budget became the first casualty for most businesses. Projects trickled in, then dried up completely. Weeks bled into months, and I could feel my savings evaporating. I picked up side jobs, stocking shelves at a grocery store overnight, folding sweaters in a department store, scrubbing cafe tables for tips. But it was never enough. My rent notices piled up on the kitchen counter, bright red letters screaming at me every time I walked by. The night my landlord taped the eviction notice to my door, I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by half-packed boxes. My hands shook as I dialed my parents. The phone rang 4 times before my mother answered. "Hello?" "Mom, it's me," I whispered. My throat already ached with shame. "I need help." There was silence, then muffled voices in the background. I heard my father before I even recognized his words. "Tell her we don't have the money. She made her bed." My mother came back on the line, her tone clipped. "Your father's right. We're paying Melissa's law school tuition. We just can't take on your situation right now." "Please," I begged, tears sliding down my cheeks. "Just 1 month's rent." "I'll pay you back. I have interviews." "Danielle?" Dad's voice cut in, cold and final. "We warned you about chasing some pipe dream. Maybe this will teach you to make better choices. We can't help you." The line went dead.
I stared at the silent phone, heart splintering in my chest. They had chosen Melissa's tuition over my roof. They had chosen her future over my survival. 2 weeks later, I was out. I packed what I could into my 12-year-old Honda Civic, my design laptop, a box of clothes, and a few framed sketches. The rest went into a storage unit I paid for with the last $100 in my account. That night, I parked in the far corner of a Walmart lot, reclined the driver's seat, and wrapped my coat tighter around me, the hum of distant traffic mixed with the hollow ache in my stomach. I was 24 years old, homeless, and utterly alone. Days blurred together. I showered at the gym I still had a cheap membership to, drying my hair under the hand dryer when no one was watching. I used library computers to send out resumes, pretending to be just another student killing time. I rationed granola bars and dollar menu burgers, learning to ignore the gnawing hunger in my gut. At night, I called and texted Melissa, hoping maybe she'd answer even if my parents wouldn't. Nothing. No reply. I drove past their house once, lights glowing warmly inside, silhouettes moving across the curtains. They were all together, laughing, eating, living, and I was outside in the cold, invisible. One evening, shivering in the Civic, I looked in the rearview mirror. My reflection startled me. My cheeks were hollow, my eyes ringed with exhaustion, my once straightened hair now frizzed from too many nights in damp air. I barely recognized myself. For the first time, I wondered if maybe my father had been right. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe chasing design had been foolish. The thought almost broke me. But then, in the echo chamber of my mind, I heard Grandpa George's voice. Build your own shelter, brick by brick. I clung to that voice like a lifeline, even as I sank deeper than I'd ever imagined. Because if I let go of that, if I let their rejection define me, I knew I'd never climb out. The Civic had become my world, bed, closet, dining room. But one rainy afternoon, when the windows fogged over and I sat hunched in the corner of a coffee shop nursing a cup of tea I couldn't really afford, the world cracked open in a way I hadn't expected. I was scrolling through job postings on my battered laptop when I heard someone say my name. Danielle Carter? I looked up, startled. Standing by my table was Adrian Miller, a colleague from my old agency. He looked exactly the same, sharp blazer, warm brown eyes, but cleaner, more put together, like he'd landed on his feet when the company fell apart. Adrian, I breathed, embarrassment flooding my face. My clothes were wrinkled, my hair pulled back in a messy knot, and my cheeks burned at the thought of him seeing me like this. I thought that was you, he said, sliding into the chair across from me before I could protest. I've been trying to track people down since the closure. How are you? The polite question was my undoing. For weeks, I'd been holding myself together with string and tape, but now the words tumbled out. Not great, I admitted. Actually, I've been living out of my car. Adrian's expression softened. He didn't flinch, didn't mask pity behind awkward silence. Instead, he leaned closer. Danielle, why didn't you reach out? We all went through hell after the agency collapsed. You don't have to go through this alone. Tears stung my eyes. Everyone else seemed to bounce back. I didn't want to be the failure. You're not a failure, he said firmly. You're surviving, and that counts for something. I pressed my lips together, unsure how to respond. Listen, Adrian continued, lowering his voice. My friend Sophia runs a small web studio. She's been looking for someone with design experience. It's not glamorous, but it's steady. Let me introduce you. Hope flickered, weak but real. You'd do that for me? He smiled. Of course. You're talented, Danielle. Too talented to be sitting here doubting yourself. That night, Adrian drove me to meet Sophia Green, his longtime friend. She lived in a modest apartment above a bakery, her living room crowded with books and sketches pinned to the walls. Sophia was petite, with cropped blonde hair and an energy that filled the room before she even spoke. So you're the designer Adrian keeps bragging about, she said, offering me a mug of chamomile tea. Let's see your work. Hands trembling, I opened my laptop and pulled up my portfolio, the projects I'd done at the agency, the freelance jobs that barely paid, the logos I'd designed for local cafes. I waited for her to frown, to tell me it wasn't enough. Instead, she nodded slowly, a grin tugging at the corner of her mouth. You've got an eye, clean lines, thoughtful composition. You understand people, not just pixels. That's rare. Relief flooded me so fast I had to grip the mug tighter. Thank you, I whispered. I can't promise the moon, Sophia said, glancing at Adrian, but I need someone reliable. Part-time at first, maybe more. We do web builds for small businesses, restaurants, local shops, clients who can't afford big agencies but still deserve good design. I blinked, hardly believing it. I'll take anything. Anything. Good, she said, standing. Then you start tomorrow. Adrian clapped me on the shoulder. Told you? Sometimes all you need is a door cracked open. That night, Sophia offered me her couch until I could find a more permanent place. As I curled under the blanket, the smell of chamomile still lingering, I felt something I hadn't in months. Safety. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't the life I'd once imagined. But it was a beginning. And for the first time since losing everything, I believed maybe, just maybe, I had a way forward. I had barely begun to settle into Sophia's spare room when the call came. My phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. Dayton, Ohio. My stomach clenched before I even answered. Hello? A woman's voice, thin and anxious, came through. Danielle? This is Nancy, your grandfather's neighbor. I've been trying to reach you. George isn't well. He's in the hospital. Pneumonia. The doctors, they don't sound hopeful. The words knocked the air out of me. I sank onto Sophia's couch, clutching the phone as if holding tighter would make the voice change its mind. Grandpa, the one constant in my life, was lying in a hospital bed fighting for breath. I'll come, I said, my voice breaking. I'll find a way. Sophia insisted on driving me to the airport herself. Don't argue, she said, pressing gas money into my hand. Go be with him. By nightfall, I was in Dayton, the same town where my summers had been filled with sawdust and garden soil. Only now, the air smelled of antiseptic and worry. When I stepped into his hospital room, the sight of him, frail, his chest rising shallowly under a thin blanket, cracked me open. Grandpa, I whispered, hurrying to his side. His eyes fluttered open, cloudy with exhaustion but lighting up when they landed on me. My Danielle, he murmured, reaching out a trembling hand. I gripped it tightly, tears streaking my cheeks. I'm here. I'm right here. We spent that night side by side. I told him about Portland, about Adrian and Sophia, about the tiny sliver of hope that had found me after months of darkness. I didn't mention the nights in my car, the rejection from my parents. I didn't want him carrying that weight. At one point, his fingers tightened weakly around mine. Listen to me, he rasped. In the drawer of my bag, there's a box. Take it. Confused, I reached into the worn leather satchel Nancy had brought from his house. Inside was a small wooden box, smooth from years of handling. I opened it to find a folded document and a brass key. My will, he whispered. And the key to the cottage. It's yours. Always meant for you. My heart lurched. Grandpa, no, don't talk like that. You'll get better. You'll go home again. He shook his head slowly, his eyes sharp even through the haze of pain. Home belongs with you now. You're the one who'll love it, care for it, not your parents, not Melissa, you. I pressed the key to my chest, sobbing. I don't deserve this. Yes, you do, he said firmly, his voice carrying the strength that had always anchored me. Promise me you'll keep building, Danielle. Promise me you won't let them take this from you. I promise, I whispered. 2 days later, he slipped away in his sleep, his hand still wrapped around mine. The funeral was small, mostly neighbors and old friends. My parents showed up with Melissa, their faces drawn into masks of grief, but none of them took charge of arrangements. That fell to me, signing papers, speaking with the pastor, choosing the flowers he would have liked. I tried to stay composed, but during the reading of the will, my parents' composure shattered. The lawyer's voice was calm as he explained. Grandpa George had left the cottage, his savings, and a portion of his tools to me. My mother received a few keepsakes, Melissa a small photo album.
My father's jaw tightened. This must be some kind of mistake. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Mr. Thompson updated his will last year, in full possession of his faculties. There is no mistake. Melissa crossed her arms, her tone sharp.
He barely saw you, Danielle. Why would he leave everything to you? I swallowed hard, refusing to let them see me waver. Because I was there, because I loved him, because I listened. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but not the kind born of loss. They were angry tears. He always favored you, she spat, even when you didn't deserve it. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that would change the bitterness etched into their faces. Instead, I signed the necessary papers, collected the keys, and left the courthouse with a strange mix of grief and gratitude swirling inside me. That night, I walked into the cottage alone. The air still smelled faintly of cedar, the walls lined with the shelves Grandpa built. Dust floated in the evening light, slanting through the curtains. My chest ached with the loss, but as I turned the brass key in my hand, I remembered his words. Build your own shelter. Don't let them take it from you. And for the first time in months, I felt the ground solid under my feet again. The first night in Grandpa's cottage, I sat on the hardwood floor with nothing but my suitcase and the hum of the old refrigerator. Grief pressed heavy on my chest, but beneath it pulsed a quiet sense of safety. For months, I'd lived in constant motion. Car seats, borrowed couches, strangers' coffee shops. Now, with the turn of a key, I finally had a place no one could take from me. The house wasn't perfect. The wallpaper in the kitchen was peeling, the pipes groaned when I turned on the water, and the shag carpet in the living room still smelled faintly of mothballs. But the bones were strong, just like Grandpa had promised. I could almost hear his voice. It doesn't need to be fancy, just make it yours. The next morning, I made a list of repairs. The handwriting wobbled from exhaustion, but seeing tasks on paper steadied me. Patch the roof, repaint the walls, clear out the garden. It wasn't just a to-do list, it was a blueprint for rebuilding my life. Sophia stopped by that weekend, balancing takeout containers in her arms. She took one look at the dusty curtains and laughed. This place has character, she said, and potential. Lots of potential. I grinned, wiping sweat from my forehead after pulling weeds all morning. Think so? Because right now it smells like old carpet and mildew? Exactly, she teased. That means the only way to go is up. Together, we spread out picnic blankets on the floor and ate noodles straight from the carton. For the first time since Grandpa's funeral, I laughed without forcing it. Work at Sophia's studio helped too. The hours were steady, and the projects, websites for local bakeries, logos for mom-and-pop shops, reminded me why I loved design in the first place. It wasn't about flashy campaigns or big corporate accounts. It was about helping people tell their stories. With every paycheck, I invested back into the cottage. A new desk in the front room became my home office. I painted the walls a soft gray, hung my sketches above the workspace, and bought a second-hand chair that didn't squeak every time I leaned back. The more I built, the more the house began to feel alive again. Neighbors noticed too. Mrs. Jenkins, who lived next door, stopped by with a casserole one evening. She peered around the cottage, smiling. "George would be proud," she said softly. Her words warmed me more than the food. But the garden, that was the hardest part. Overgrown vines strangled the fences, weeds choked out Grandpa's beloved tomato beds. One Saturday, I stood there with dirt under my nails and tears on my cheeks, overwhelmed. That's when a memory hit me. Grandpa's rough hands guiding mine in the soil, saying, "You'll learn patience here. Plants grow the same way people do, slowly, stubbornly." So I kept digging. One patch at a time, though. A month later, green shoots pushed through the soil, small but defiant. I knelt beside them, whispering, "We're both still here." Evenings became my favorite. I'd sit on the porch swing, laptop balanced on my knees, working as the sun slipped behind the trees. Some nights, Adrian dropped by with pizza, joking about his disastrous attempts to cook. Other nights, Sophia brought books for inspiration. Slowly, I realized I wasn't just rebuilding a house. I was weaving a new circle of people who actually cared. Still, shadows lingered. Every creak in the floor reminded me of the emptiness inside. Every envelope in the mailbox made my stomach clench, half expecting it to be another bitter letter from my parents. But weeks turned to months, and their silence stretched on. For the first time in my life, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. One evening, as I closed my laptop and stepped into the garden, I caught myself smiling at the rows of young plants. The cottage no longer looked like a relic of the past. It looked like a beginning. I whispered into the dusk, as if Grandpa could still hear me. "I'm building, just like you said, brick by brick." The garden was finally showing signs of life when the town began to notice me too. At first it was small gestures, Mrs. Jenkins waving when I checked the mail, the mailman pausing to ask how the renovations were going, a neighbor dropping off fresh eggs from her chickens. After months of isolation and silence from my parents, the kindness felt almost suspicious, like sunlight after weeks of storms. But community has a way of seeping in, whether you expect it or not. One afternoon, while running errands, I ducked into a small bookstore on Main Street. The window display caught my eye. Secondhand novels stacked beside a chalkboard sign that read, "Coffee and Stories Inside." The smell of fresh espresso hit me the moment I walked in, blending with the earthy scent of old paper. Behind the counter stood a man in his 30s with rolled-up sleeves, a dusting of flour on his forearm, as though he'd been baking instead of shelving books. His eyes were the kind that seemed to hold both humor and gentleness, even before he smiled. "Welcome," he said. "First time here?" I nodded, tucking a stray curl behind my ear. "Yeah, I didn't know there was a bookstore and cafe here." "We've only been open a year," he said, wiping his hands on a towel. "I'm Ethan Evans, owner, barista, part-time book hoarder." The corner of my mouth lifted. "Danielle, neighbor, freelance designer, occasional coffee addict." "Well then," he said, leaning on the counter, "let me bribe you into becoming a regular. First cup's on the house." I hesitated. Free always felt like pity, but his grin wasn't patronizing. It was easy, warm. So I accepted. "In that case, I'll take a cappuccino." As he worked the machine, we fell into conversation. He asked about the cottage, and when I mentioned it had belonged to my grandfather, his expression softened. "George Thompson, right? Everyone in town knew him. Solid man. Helped me replace a porch beam once, refused to take a dime. Said I could pay him back by helping someone else someday." My chest tightened. That sounds like him. Ethan slid the cappuccino across the counter. The foam formed a clumsy heart, which made me laugh. "Not bad," I said, taking a sip. He chuckled. "I make bookshelves better than latte art. Stick around and I'll prove it." And I did stick around. I started dropping by once or twice a week, sometimes to work on my laptop, sometimes just for conversation. Ethan would recommend books, always slipping in titles he swore would inspire my design projects. He had a knack for choosing exactly what I needed without me realizing it. Over time, our exchanges grew less about small talk and more about life. He told me how he'd inherited the store from his uncle, how he wanted it to be more than just a place to buy books, a gathering spot where people felt less alone. I told him about my freelance work, my dream of building something bigger. One evening, as I was packing up my laptop, he leaned against a shelf and asked, "What's really keeping you here in this town? You could take your skills anywhere." I paused, surprised at the question. Because for the first time, I feel like I belong somewhere. This cottage, this town, it's mine. No one handed it to me. I fought for it. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "That's rare. Most people spend their lives chasing places to belong. Sounds like you built yours." His words echoed in me long after I left the shop. It wasn't just Ethan, though. The town itself wrapped its arms around me. Local shop owners asked for design help, neighbors invited me to potlucks, and soon my weekends filled with small projects and gatherings. Every handshake, every thank you note chipped away at the hollow space my family's rejection had carved inside me. But Ethan was different. His presence wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, like the porch swing on summer nights,
like the sound of rain on the cottage roof, and slowly, without realizing it, I began to lean toward him the way plants lean toward light. Peace has a way of making you believe the storm has finally passed. For nearly 5 years, I poured myself into the cottage, my design studio, and the small circle of people who had become my chosen family. Ethan's steady presence, Sophia's encouragement, and the warmth of neighbors gave me roots I'd never known as a child. I let myself believe the silence from my parents meant they'd finally moved on, that Melissa had found her place somewhere far away. I should have known better. The first sign was an email landing in my inbox on a Tuesday morning between client drafts. The sender's name made my stomach drop, Melissa Carter. I hadn't seen or heard from her since Grandpa's funeral. The subject line read simply, "Checking in." I clicked it open, my heart pounding. "Danielle, it's been too long. I came across your company's website. Very impressive. Mom and Dad say they haven't heard from you in ages and are worried. We should catch up soon. Love, Melissa. Love." The word felt like a splinter under my skin. She hadn't answered a single message when I was living in my car, but now she loved me. I showed Ethan the email that afternoon at the bookstore cafe. He raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like she wants something. People don't just reappear after 5 years out of the kindness of their hearts." I wanted to dismiss his suspicion, but deep down, I felt it too. Still, I couldn't quite prepare myself for what came next. 3 days later, my phone lit up with a call from Mom. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Danielle, sweetheart." Her voice was artificially bright, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. "It's so good to hear your voice after all this time." I swallowed hard. "This is unexpected." "Yes, well, your father and I were just talking about you. We're so proud of everything you've accomplished. We saw your website. Such beautiful work." Her words should have made me glow, but instead they rang hollow, rehearsed. Before I could respond, she pressed on. "We feel terrible about misunderstandings in the past. Families go through difficult seasons, but it's important to heal. We'd love to come visit." "Misunderstandings?" My voice sharpened. "That's what you call turning me away when I had nowhere else to go?" There was a pause. When she spoke again, her tone dropped. "We all made mistakes, Danielle. But that's in the past. Let's focus on rebuilding now." Something in me tightened. They wanted forgiveness on their timeline without ever acknowledging the damage. That evening, I received another call, this time from Dad. His voice carried the same false warmth. "We're a family, Danielle. It's time we acted like one again." "What do you want?" I asked bluntly. He hesitated, then sighed. "Things haven't been easy. I took early retirement after some complications at the bank. Your mother's back isn't what it used to be. Melissa had a string of bad investments. We're just trying to keep our heads above water." There it was, the truth behind the sudden interest. I leaned back in my chair, the cottage walls solid around me. "And now you think I can fix it?" "Not fix," he said quickly. "Just help. We thought maybe we could visit, see the cottage, reconnect." Against my better judgment, I agreed to a Saturday lunch, not overnight, not open-ended, just lunch. Ethan offered to be there for support, and I accepted. The following weekend, my family pulled into the driveway at noon sharp. I stood on the porch, my hands clenched, as they climbed out of their sedan. Dad looked older, shoulders slumped. Mom's face was lined, though her eyes darted eagerly toward the house. Melissa lingered behind, her gaze sweeping the property with undisguised interest. Inside, I served sandwiches and salad at the kitchen table. Conversation was stiff, full of forced compliments. "This kitchen," Mom said, running her fingers along the counter. "So much nicer than when George had it. You must have spent a fortune." "Every penny I earned myself," I replied evenly. Dad nodded, eyeing the appliances. "Seems your little design business is paying off." "Elevation Designs is doing well," Ethan interjected smoothly, his hand brushing mine under the table. Their questions kept circling back to the cottage, its size, its value, the renovations. When Melissa asked if I had the original deed, alarm bells went off in my head.
After lunch, she excused herself to use the bathroom. She was gone a long time. When she returned, her phone was in her hand. "Getting good reception here," she said casually, though her eyes flicked around the living room. "This house has solid bones. Really good investment property." That night, after they drove off, Ethan and I cleaned up in silence. Finally, he said what I had been too afraid to voice. "Danielle, your sister was taking pictures. I saw her, and your dad kept asking about property values like he was appraising the place." My stomach sank. They're planning something. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew he was right. Their smiles, their praise, it had all been bait. And the storm I thought I'd outrun was gathering at my doorstep once again. Ethan's warning clung to me long after my family's car disappeared down the road. I wanted to believe I was just being paranoid, that Melissa's photos were harmless and Dad's questions were idle curiosity. But my gut wouldn't let it go, so I called my lawyer the next morning. "Review the paperwork again," I told him. "I need to know the cottage is airtight legally." He assured me everything was in my name, that my grandfather's will had been signed, notarized, and reinforced by medical assessments of his sound mind. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said firmly. It helped, but only a little. Ethan, ever practical, convinced me to install security cameras around the property. "They may not have a legal claim, Danielle," he said as we mounted one above the back porch, "but that doesn't mean they won't try something reckless." 3 weeks later, I was in Boston for a design conference, 3 days of networking, workshops, and the chance to expand my client base. It felt like a step forward, proof I was finally building the life Grandpa had dreamed for me. On the second night, my phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Jenkins, my next-door neighbor. "Thought you weren't back until tomorrow. Lights are on at your place. Saw people moving inside. Everything okay?" My blood ran cold. I called her immediately. "Mrs. Jenkins, I'm still in Boston. Who's in my house?" "Oh dear," she said, worry thick in her voice. "Should I call the police?" "Not yet. Let me check my cameras first." My hands shook as I pulled up the security app. The footage loaded slowly, my heart hammering in my throat. And then I saw it. My father's car parked in the driveway, trunk open, boxes spilling out. The back door splintered where he'd forced it open. Mom carried in suitcases while Melissa filmed the living room with her phone like she was cataloging her new prize. "No," I whispered, bile rising in my throat. "No, no, no." I called Ethan, my voice trembling. "They've broken in. They're moving in as if it's theirs." "Stay calm," he said. "I'll drive over right now. Do you want me to call the police?" "Not yet. Let me try calling them first." I dialed my father. He declined. I tried Mom. No answer. Melissa, straight to voicemail. Desperate, I called the landline inside the cottage. After a few rings, Melissa answered. "Hello, Carter residence," she chirped, her tone dripping with smugness. "Melissa, what the hell are you doing in my house?" I snapped. There was a pause, then a sigh. "Relax. We were going to call you tomorrow." "We're just getting settled." "Settled? You broke in! You're trespassing!" "Don't be dramatic," she replied coolly. "This is a family home. We're family. You don't need all that space for yourself." In the background, I heard Dad's voice. "Tell her the decision's been made." Melissa lowered her tone, her false sweetness gone. "Look, Danielle, we need this house. You can't expect us to rot in that tiny apartment while you play designer in a 3-bedroom cottage." My anger surged hot and sharp. "This house was left to me. Grandpa wanted me here, not you. Get out before I call the police." Her voice hardened. "That would be a mistake. Calling the cops on your own family? Think how cruel that looks. Besides, Dad's already talked to a lawyer. Grandpa wasn't of sound mind when he made the will. We have a case." It was a bluff. I knew Grandpa had undergone regular evaluations, but the audacity still rattled me. I ended the call, booked an early flight home, and barely slept. When Ethan picked me up at the airport, his face was grim. "They're still there. I tried knocking this morning, and your dad answered the door like he owned the place. Told me it was a family matter and to mind my business." As we pulled into the driveway, the sight made my stomach twist. My mother's decorative pillows sat on the porch swing. My father's golf clubs leaned against the wall. Through the window, I saw Melissa rearranging the living room furniture, my framed sketches dumped in a pile on the floor. I unlocked the front door with my key and stepped inside. The air smelled of Mom's perfume and Dad's aftershave, scents that felt like trespass in my sanctuary. Mom emerged from the kitchen, startled. "Danielle, we weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "Clearly," I replied coldly. "Where's Dad?" "In the master bedroom, organizing his clothes," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My blood boiled. My father, was hanging his suits in my closet. I stormed down the hall and flung open the door. He turned, unbothered. "You're back early." "This is my room," I spat. He waved a dismissive hand. "You can use one of the other bedrooms. This arrangement makes sense for everyone." "Like hell it does. Get your things out, now." By the time we gathered in the living room, Ethan standing firmly at my side, the air was electric with tension. My parents perched on the couch like rightful owners, Melissa leaning against the wall with her phone recording. "You need to leave," I said, my voice shaking but steady. Dad leaned forward, his tone condescending. "Danielle, be reasonable. This house has room for all of us. You're alone here, rattling around with your little business, while we're crammed into a shoebox. A family home should serve the family." "This is my home," I snapped. "Legally. Morally. Grandpa gave it to me because I cared for it. Because I cared for him." Mom's eyes flashed. "And what about us? We need this more than you do. You don't even have a family. No husband, no children. Just you and your hobby." My throat tightened, but Ethan squeezed my hand. "My business supports me," I shot back. "And I do have a family, the people who didn't abandon me when I was homeless." Melissa rolled her eyes. "Ancient history. We're here now, ready to be a family again." "You're here because you want what isn't yours," I said flatly. Dad's face hardened. "We will take this house, Danielle, one way or another." That was the moment I knew talking was useless. I pulled out my phone and dialed 3 numbers. Mom's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "Calling the police," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "You wouldn't dare!" Melissa shrieked. "Family doesn't break into each other's homes," I replied. Within 15 minutes, 2 officers arrived. I handed them my deed and ID, explaining everything. Dad tried to argue it was a family matter, but the officer cut him off. "Sir, if you don't have legal residence here and the homeowner wants you out, you leave. Otherwise, you'll be arrested for trespassing." The next half hour was a blur. My parents gathering their things under police supervision, Melissa seething as she stuffed her phone in her pocket. Mom's final words echoed bitterly as she passed me on the porch. "How could you do this to your own parents?" I met her gaze, voice low. "The same way you turned your back when I needed you most." When their car finally pulled away, the silence was deafening. Relief, grief, and fury tangled inside me until I could hardly breathe. Ethan wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "You did the right thing," he murmured. I stared out at the driveway, where their tire marks still scarred the gravel. "Maybe," I whispered, "but it shouldn't have come to this." The police cruiser's taillights disappeared down the road, taking my parents and Melissa with them, and I stood frozen on the porch. The night air was heavy, thick with silence. Relief warred with exhaustion, grief with grim satisfaction. For the first time, they hadn't been able to talk their way out, to twist my resolve into guilt. For the first time, I had drawn a line they couldn't cross. But the battle wasn't over. The following week was consumed by lawyers, paperwork, and hearings. Brian's phone records, obtained legally by my attorney, exposed messages between him and Melissa planning the move-in. Screenshots of my dad's texts revealed their scheme. "If she resists, we'll claim duress, emotional hardship, force her hand." Their bravado collapsed under evidence. The judge dismissed their claims to the property outright, citing the will, Grandpa George's clean medical records, and the clear premeditation shown in their own words. My father and Brian faced misdemeanor charges for the break-in, community service, and probation.
Melissa wasn't charged, but her involvement was plain for all to see. When the gavel came down, I exhaled the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for months. My lawyer leaned close and whispered, "It's over. The house is yours. Untouchable now." But victory didn't taste sweet. It was tinged with ash. Watching my family scowl in the courtroom, I realized no judge could restore what had been broken between us. Outside, reporters asked if I had anything to say. I simply answered, "Family is not a right. It's a responsibility. They failed that responsibility." Then I walked away. Back at the cottage, Ethan was waiting with takeout and quiet arms. When I sank against him on the porch swing, he didn't ask questions. He didn't offer empty comfort. He just held me as I cried, the tears spilling for everything. Lost years, fractured bloodlines, and the tiny shard of hope I had still clung to, even after everything. Weeks passed. The restraining order became permanent. The Carters receded from my daily life, though gossip from town trickled in. Melissa had moved out of state, Dad nursed his bitterness like a badge, Mom kept to herself more and more. For me, life finally began to bloom again. I expanded Elevation Designs, taking on 2 employees from the community college's design program. The cottage garage transformed into a small but bustling studio. Clients came not only from nearby towns, but from across state lines. My garden flourished. Tomatoes, roses, lavender, all sprouting from the soil that once looked hopeless. Neighbors stopped by regularly. Mrs. Jenkins brought her famous peach cobbler. Tom from the hardware store saved me vintage fixtures for the house. The community became my net, holding me up in ways my family never had. And Ethan, steady, thoughtful Ethan, was always there. The day he knelt in Grandpa's garden with a simple silver ring, he didn't make grand promises. He just said, "You deserve a family who sees your worth. I'd be honored to start that family with you." Tears blurred my vision as I said yes. Months later, on the morning of our wedding, I stood in the same garden where Grandpa once taught me patience. Sunlight filtered through the trees, catching on the blossoms I had coaxed back to life. Sophia straightened my veil, her eyes shining, while Adrian fiddled nervously with the sound system. Neighbors filled the chairs, laughter floating through the air. No Carters in sight, and I didn't miss them. When Ethan slipped the ring onto my finger, the world felt right. The home that had once been a battleground was now the foundation of a new beginning. After the wedding, I poured energy into a project close to my heart, a small foundation in Grandpa's name, offering mentorship and temporary housing for young adults cut off by toxic families. The first resident, a design student named Jamie, reminded me so much of myself at 20. Watching her confidence grow, giving her the tools I once begged for, it felt like closing a painful circle. Late one night, sitting on the porch swing with Ethan, I looked around at the life I had built. The cottage glowed warmly, the garden thrived, laughter and love filled the air. For the first time in years, I wasn't surviving. I was living. If you've listened this far, you already know my story isn't just about a house. It's about worth. It's about the courage to defend what's yours, even when the people standing against you are the ones who should have stood beside you. I've learned that family isn't defined by blood. Blood gives you relatives, but love, respect, and loyalty, that's what makes family. Sometimes the ones you expect to catch you let you fall. And sometimes the people you least expect, neighbors, colleagues, even strangers, become the ones who lift you higher than you thought possible. I lost my parents and sister in the fight for this home. But I gained something stronger. A husband who sees me, a community that values me, and a mission that gives meaning to the pain I endured. So here's my message to you. Never let anyone decide your worth. Protect what matters, set boundaries without guilt, and don't be afraid to build your own family from the ground up. If my story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need the reminder that they're not alone. And tell me in the comments, what's the family you've built for yourself?